This section focuses on the implementation of asynchronous and reactive components of Jakarta EE that will help the platform minimize its chances of having an out-of-memory problem and thread exhaustion. Some filters and servlets have processes in them which ask for inputs from any sources or generate responses which requires waiting time. This first recipe of this section will provide us some procedures on how to handle this kind of blocking transactions which may cause starvation of resources in the long run. Before implementing anything, the platform will execute asynchronous processes only if the application server has configured a thread pool of minimum and maximum number of threads which can be utilized to process various blocking transactions. If you have done so, you can now create your Maven project with the CDI bin descriptor file, filters, and servlets which can process its own asynchronous transactions using those threads. For a servlet to employ asynchronous processing, the async supported parameter of its web servlet annotation must be set to true. We also do the same to all our filter components. To set the whole HTTP request into async mode, a filter or a servlet must extract an instance of the async context through the HTTP servlet request. This async context contains all the necessary methods to perform asynchronous transactions inside a given HTTP service method. On the other hand, an asynchronous process is composed of independent, non-blocking transactions, just like here in my save order, which can be grouped together as one runnable unit of work. This runnable process will be delegated to a separate thread once the start method of a sync context is invoked. During the thread execution, this non-blocking transaction will process its own requests and will generate its own response, just like here. In this case of save order, I will generate a JSON object and write it or serialize it into a file and will output on our response page with this data. After a successful thread execution, do not forget to call the complete method of async context to finish and exit the whole asynchronous process. Whichever will finish first, both the main thread and the async context thread will contribute to the final response of the application. Now, once the async context is done with the thread, it will return it back to the thread pool. Let us now compile and run this application to check some results. This application still uses the same product form controller, which will accept all the product information to generate a product object. But this time, this application will use async context to serialize the product object to JSON file using JSON-B. Now, this final response page here consists of two different outputs from two different threads. The first line here came from the main thread, while the second line here came from async context. Another way of closing an asynchronous request and response process is through the dispatch method of async context. In the search controller servlet, it is the blocking transaction that transfers the control of the process to another JSP or servlet. Now, once this method is used, it is advisable for the main thread not to invoke its request dispatcher to avoid some conflicts. To further manage asynchronous processing, it is a best practice to set an appropriate timeout for an async context that performs bulky and complex blocking transactions. Lengthy executions for an asynchronous transaction will consume all the default timeout set for a servlet, which will lead to illegal state exceptions or an unwanted retry. To monitor and manage internal processing events, such as managing exceptions whenever a timeout problem is encountered, we can add a sync listener and implement its callback methods. To further enhance and control the execution of an asynchronous process, a custom created thread executor service can be used instead of invoking the start method of an async context. Let us now compile and run this search controller. By the way, running this servlet will generate this response on its JSP page. Our search controller with its response page.